Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who contribute their ideas and their time and their energy to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions are they the most pleased about? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. Words to describe the story of Philip G. Hubbard are integrity, loyalty, decency, dedication, and an educator, quiet benefactor, and diplomat. Phil Hubbard, Professor Emeritus of Mechanical Engineering, retired in 1991 after more than 40 years of service to the University of Iowa. He graduated from the University of Iowa in '46 with honors in electrical engineering, and then went on at the university and received his master's and doctorate in engineering. A professor for many years, Phil Hubbard was appointed Dean of Academic Affairs in 1966, and then named Vice President for Student Services in 1971. He has served the university with honor and distinction. In 1981, the Philip G. Hubbard Human Rights Award was established to honor a student who had made a significant contribution to the cause of human rights to the university and to Iowa City. In 1988, Phil Hubbard developed and became director of Opportunity at Iowa, a minority recruiting and retaining program. In 1990, the land across from the Iowa Memorial Union and along the Iowa River was named Hubbard Park in his honor. And in the spring of '91, Phil was awarded the Hancher Finkbein Medallion for learning, loyalty, and leadership. A member of the United Methodist Church Choir, the Iowa City Library Board of Trustees, Mr. Hubbard is keeping busy in his retirement year. He and his wife, Winona, raised 5 children in Iowa City. Welcome, Phil, to Tell Me Your Story.
Oh, thank you. I've been looking forward to it.
You were born in 1921 in Macon, Missouri. How did you get to Iowa and Des Moines?
Shortly after I was born, my father died. In fact, it was just 18 days. My mother then taught school in Macon and Moberly, Missouri, and I lived with my grandmother. When I was 4, she married an Iowan, and so we then moved to Des Moines.
Mm-hmm. And your mother did not teach school then?
In Des Moines, she couldn't teach because the schools in Iowa at that time were only half open, or half desegregated, you might say. Her motivation for being interested in coming to Iowa was primarily to get a better education for her children. Mm-hmm. And it was indeed a very good education for the children. The schools were of high quality and not segregated, but they did not permit blacks to teach. And so she had to sacrifice her profession in order to get a better education for her children.
How many children did she have?
5. I was the 4th one at that time, and then she had 1 later after we moved to Des Moines.
And you're the grandson of an African Methodist Episcopal minister.
That's right. My grandfather and his brother were both AME, that's what they call it, ministers, and they were assigned different places by the bishop, so that it's just by happenstance that my father was born in Omaha, because that's where his father was assigned at the time. But the family home was in Macon, Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Now, you went to North High School in Des Moines and graduated there. I just read that they recently inducted you into their Hall of Fame, Alumni Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. They were very kind, and it was a very good school. I think that these public schools in Des Moines did an excellent job of preparing the children for the future.
How it was obviously desegregated.
Oh, yes.
How many African Americans were in your high school? Do you remember about?
When I got to high school, there were probably maybe 5%. But when we first moved to Des Moines, the home we lived in was at the edge of the black kind of ghetto, not exactly a ghetto, but the school that I lived in was on the white side of that dividing line, so that I had very few black or minority classmates of any kind until I was in high school, where there were more, and there may have been 5%.
Now, when you graduated, you didn't have enough money to go to college. You spent a year doing something in Des Moines at the Savory Hotel, and you ended up doing it here too, didn't you, at the Jefferson?
Well, I was following in the footsteps of my brothers, who had shined shoes and worked as janitors in the theaters in Des Moines. Well, I took the shoe shining route because it was more compatible with my schedule, and worked there for a year and a half, shining shoes and keeping the restroom clean in exchange for the rent on the facilities I was there. And having a profession, I then continued to practice it after coming here as a freshman, and it was in the basement of the Jefferson Hotel. And it was a very good way of working one's way through school, because the hours were completely flexible. I had no boss, so that I could work and shine shoes, and then when there were no customers, I could study. And during World War II, the university was the home of the Naval Pre-Flight School, and so we had these splendid young naval officers come there. One of them came into the hotel one day to get a shoe shine, and he sat down and he picked up the book I had been reading, and it said Principles of Chemical Engineering. He says, "Is this your book?" I said, "Yes, I'm studying chemical engineering." Well, he was quite impressed, and he gave me $5. And in 1943, $5 was a lot of money. I never forgot him. He said his name was Charles Smith.
It's a wonderful story. So you were in electrical engineering as an undergraduate, shining shoes to make money.
Chemical engineering.
Excuse me, chemical engineering.
I finally graduated in electrical, but that was because the Army sent me to school. And the Army has its own way of deciding what you will be. And the day that they were signing me, they didn't need chemical engineers. And so I had a choice between mechanical and electrical. And almost by the flip of a coin, I chose electrical engineering. And they then sent me to Penn State. And that's where I finished.
Where did you live when you first came to Iowa City as a student, as an undergraduate?
As with all of the other black students here, I lived with a private family. The ones I lived with first were Mr. and Mrs. Carl Culbertson, and the second year I lived with people named Hester, and then the third year I lived with a family named Ferguson. And Mother Ferguson is one of the old traditions of Iowa City. She has been honored by the students for her dedication.
So when you came, you stayed in a private home. What did the black women students do? Where did they live?
Well, that's a good question. I said the black men lived in private homes, and the reason was they were not permitted to live in the dormitories. But the women very seldom lived in private homes unless they happened to have a job as a babysitter or a housekeeper. The Women's Club of Iowa rented a home, or they bought a home and maintained it for the black women. And that's where they lived, and so we called it the girls' house. And so we all knew that 942 Iowa Avenue was the place where the women lived, and my wife lived there. But the reason was that we couldn't live in the residence halls until after World War II.
How did you meet your wife, Winona?
I knew her in Des Moines.
Oh,
she was a native of West Des Moines, and so I knew her while she was still in high school. I think I may have graduated, but I had known her for quite a while, and then she moved to Iowa City as a student after I did.
So were you married when you went off to Penn State?
We were planning to get married after I graduated, but I was called into active duty 1 year before graduating, and so we decided there was no need to wait longer, so we got married 1 year before I would have graduated, and after they sent me to school, she joined me there at Penn State. I lived in the fraternity house, which they called a barracks. The Army simply took over fraternity houses and housed the students there. And she got a job working for the treasurer of the university. And so we were together there in Penn State.
Now, when you came back after the war to Iowa City, there was a wonderful story I read about that some of the kids didn't have a place to meet, a fraternity, and you turned your lower level, your basement, into a fraternity house. Tell me about this.
Well, I had been initiated into the fraternity as an undergraduate here, and then when I bought a house and the chapter had no place to meet, I decided that they could meet at my house. And so I painted the basement in the colors of the fraternity and set up a little archives there for their records, and brought in folding chairs for the meetings. And 2 or 3 of the fraternity men lived with us too, because I had bought a 3-bedroom house and we didn't have any children at that time. One was born a little later. And so we rented out rooms to students and let them hold their fraternity meetings in the basement.
So when you came back, you got your master's and your PhD at Iowa, and then you taught. And you became an administrator after you taught for, what, 10, 15 years in the college?
It was actually, as a graduate student, 20 years. 20 years. Including the period as a graduate student.
Was that a difficult transition for you to move from the classroom into administration?
Well, it was in a sense, because I remember when I later went to a small college in Memphis, they said, how can an engineer be a dean? And I told them, well, deans have to study something, and there's no curriculum in deanology. But it wasn't too hard, because I had been working with many community agencies. I had been teaching Sunday school. I worked with the Kiwanis Club and became its president. I worked with Sandy Boyd on the developments leading to the adoption of the Fair Housing Ordinance and so forth, and had been working with the people who were going on the freedom rides to the South. So that my experience was not typical for an engineer. And Willard Boyd was an excellent teacher, and his specialty was working with people, of course. And so I learned a great deal from him. I had to recognize the fact that when an engineer or a scientist wants to discover the truth, we go to the laboratory or to the field. When you wish to discover the truth in working with people, the truth lies in the people, not in the physical world. And once I learned that, and that we should always consult people, and that the inner world was the place where one could be most effective, it was easy then.
You had some very difficult times to be in administration and head of student services. I read a lot of articles in newspapers and magazines about your time during the 60s, and there's this wonderful quote from the Daily Iowan of yours. Let me quote it. It said, "My academic specialty was turbulence. When I came here, the campus was erupting. It was a very turbulent place." Tell me about your involvement in the 60s.
Those were indeed turbulent times. Many people call the period one of riots. It's true there were demonstrations, and sometimes they got out of hand. The students were frequently turned out of the residence halls by a false alarm, and once they were out, then they were harangued by demonstrators and urged to march on something. They would march on the old Capitol, but on the way they would pass the businesses downtown, and they would throw rocks through the windows, and were generally quite destructive. a bomb was set off in one of the trash containers downtown early in the morning so that no one was hurt. But people were very, very uneasy. At one time, the students set up a huge catapult on the roof of the quadrangle using a full inner tube as a propelling mechanism, and the objects they hurled were bottles and bricks into the intersection of Riverside Drive and Grand Avenue. And it was very dangerous, of course, so they had to stop the traffic. Another time, the students marched out to the interstate and stopped the traffic there by just going out and walking on it. The highway patrol had to set up roadblocks up on both sides to intercept the traffic so that no one would be hurt. There was a helicopter flying overhead with huge searchlight trying to get things under control. And I would always be there as part of the group which is trying to maintain control. So, and
did they let you into their groups? I mean, were you treated with...
yes. The students would hold meetings to plan their strategy. And when I learned about these, I would go to the meeting, and the students always looked askance at me, saying, "What's he doing here?" But they soon learned that I was not there as a spy, but rather to determine what it is they wanted to do and how they could do it in a way which was consistent with the principles of our society. And the purpose, always it was that if people wish to protest something, the responsibility of a university is not to prevent it, but rather to provide a forum where it could be pursued in an orderly manner. And so we would discuss with the students, we would negotiate with them. They'd say, we want to be able to have signs. And so we'd say, all right, you may carry signs, but not on sticks. You could wear them as a sandwich board, but we don't want sharp objects. And you may not block the entrances because a university must be accessible to be effective. You may stand on both sides, and if you wish to speak to people who come in and out, you may go, but you cannot stop them from coming in. Well, some of the students accepted those in general, but not always, and so there were times when they violated that agreement, and we had to bring in the authorities, and they were arrested by the hundreds. Students were arrested, taken to jail, and then we had to go bail them out.
A few professors were also jailed, weren't they?
Oh yes, my son was jailed, and the professor, George Farrell, the director of the School of Religion, was in jail with him.
What a time to be Dean of Student Services. Also, moving on to another very challenging time for you is when the university was dismantling their policy of the university being a parent to students. I'm sure that was a very tough time to deal with students' parents.
Yes, it was indeed, because many of the people who knew me and of my work before going into the administration looked upon me as a person very concerned with morals and with the protection of the morals of everyone. But in particular, they thought this would be true with the students. I had taught Sunday school and in general was active in community work. So when I helped to lower these barriers which treated women so differently from men, restricting them to certain hours in the dormitory, requiring that they undergo the indignity of bed checks, and in other ways being treated as children, they thought that I was betraying them, that they were subjecting their daughters to hazards which shouldn't be. Well, I kind of understood their point of view because I had a daughter too, and when she went to a university in Washington, D.C., I was a little worried about her as well. So I was sympathetic, but nonetheless, I felt that it was essential that we support these students through the transition And the strategy that we finally adopted was to say, we will let the parents make the decision. We will have both kinds of accommodation. And if the parents want their daughters to live in a restricted area and to come in at certain hours, we will provide it. But you must sign the contract that the student enters into to live in the residence hall.
How did that go over?
Well, the parents didn't like that very well either. They didn't like it because their children put the heat on them.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And very soon, there was no one left, or very few left. I think there was one floor that we finally retained for women who wanted special hours. But the parents, in many cases, as you might say, were dragged kicking and screaming into the agreement. But it was their daughters who were pushing them. We said, it's up to you.
What a time. How things have changed.
Oh, yes.
Many times I read you interviewed for presidencies of colleges, and one time you were going to go teach at Cal Berkeley, and President Friedman at the time urged you to stay. What was the glue that kept you in Iowa City at the University of Iowa?
Well, it is a community which is extraordinary in its openness. I have the feeling that Iowans generally are viewed by people from a distance as quite conservative. And I suppose that's okay, even though I'm not sure what these labels mean always. But they're conservative in an open way. They accept people for what they are. So that, and this was all that I felt any of us has a right to ask, that you don't prejudge me. You wait until you find out what I'm like and then decide who I am. And if you then don't like me, that's tough, because I'm not perfect. And if you find that whatever I am is something you don't like, I can accept that. Sure. But if you just take one look at me and decide I don't like you and I don't want you sitting next to me in a restaurant, I don't want you living next door to me, or for some other reason which has nothing to do with my conduct, I would feel that that is unfair. We don't find that in Iowa. And of course, Iowa City, being the home of the university, has a great many resources and facilities which are great. But I think perhaps the thing which was most important was that it was a wonderful place to raise a family. By the time President Friedman talked me into staying, my family was grown and gone. But even so, it's nice to be wanted.
You've received many honors and awards over your distinguished career. What's meant the most to you?
Well, certainly the naming of the park, which was, I thought, an expression of love.
Absolutely.
And when I say love, I'm speaking really from kind of a religious point of view, the bond among human beings. But it was a way of people saying, we appreciate what you have done, and we want to have a lasting evidence of that. Also the Human Rights Award, and the award from the faculty, the engineering faculty, made up a wonderful plaque designating me as a professor emeritus, and invited me to one of their meetings, and then handed it to me. And that was very important, because the first half of my professional career was devoted to engineering, teaching, and research. I think it's just as important to me as the later administrative work. And so I think those two things were very important. And when Willard Boyd in 1981 established the Human Rights Award with my name attached to it, I felt that that was certainly a wonderful way to thank me for what he thought was a contribution to his administration.
Reading about you, doing research before I talked to you today, I found that there is an undercurrent, a very strong commitment to a faith. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, my approach to my administrative work and to my community work have been from the viewpoint of people being the most important thing in the universe. Nothing is more important than a human being. And our differences are so small compared to what we have in common that this has guided me. And that means that I don't think in terms of adversarial relationships where people are set one against the other. I don't think like a lawyer, and I don't like choosing sides. And even though I think politics is probably the most essential of the social relationships, I don't like partisan politics. I think politics, in the sense that you try to respond to the wishes of the people, is wonderful, and that's the way to conduct things. But I don't like to set people against one another, and so I frequently say that I don't really want to work as a lawyer does, but rather as a person who wants to bring people together, emphasize the things we have in common, and recognize that there are differences, but that the differences are wonderful. We don't want to be all the same. And when I try to encourage the university to become more diverse, it's not in order to have the people separate and be compartmentalized, but rather to interact. So, and neither do I want them all to be the same. If we were to use a culinary metaphor, instead of a puree, where you simply put all of the people there and stir them up and you can't tell one from another, which is sometimes what people think the American melting pot means, I look upon it more as maybe a jambalaya, where you can pick out a piece of sausage or a shrimp or a piece of the one of the other elements in there. They're still clearly visible, but there's something which melds them all together so that the result is much better than any of them alone. And there's a spice there too.
It's a wonderful philosophy. I have two questions. What person or event had an influence on you?
Well, I've already mentioned Willard Boyd, because he helped me to recognize that you can't simply think as a scientist or an engineer and work effectively with people. It's very important to take into account their opinions, and the way to do that is to consult with them. But that went over very well with me, because I had originally come to the university with a very strong religious background. And for that I can thank my mother, because she passed on the heritage that I had received from my ancestors. But she was the only channel. I was my father's only son, and he was an only son. And so the family would have ended with me, except that I have 5 children.
Tell us about your children. Tell me where your children are and what they're about.
Well, the oldest one, Philip Jr., is a lawyer living in Seattle. His wife is she got her degree in social work. She's a probation officer and a supervisor of personnel in King County in Seattle. They have 2 children, Anthony and Monica. My daughter is the second. She lives in Iowa City, and she's married to Jim Walters. They have a son, Matthew. Jim is well known in Iowa City because he makes wonderful bread.
I buy it. It's wonderful.
We just sold at the New Pioneer. And Chris just got her degree this spring in library science. And she works at the hospital, in the psychiatric hospital, but she also works in this city library as a I guess it's a substitute librarian. The third one is Michael. Michael lives in Chapel Hill. He works for the Research Triangle Institute as a psychologist and mathematician, and his wife Carol is a nurse, and they have a son, Peter. The 4th child is Richard. Richard is a physician. His wife is a professor of anthropology at the University of Maryland, and they have 2 children, Eric and Shanti. Shanti is an Indian word, and it means peace. And she has that name because her mother was born in India, and they will all return to India this winter with her parents. who were both born in India too. The youngest is Peter. Peter lives in Iowa City. He got his doctorate last year in medieval history from the University of Wisconsin. His wife is a librarian here at the university, and she got her Master of Library Science at the University of Wisconsin. And they have 3 children. Robert, Catherine, and Neil, so that altogether I have 9 grandchildren.
You've done very well. I've had guests who blanked on their grandchildren's names, and you've got 9 of them, and you remembered every one of them. I had so many more questions to ask you, but our time has run out. You have a wonderful story to tell, Phil, and I'm so appreciative of you being here.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'd like to thank my wife, Winona, too.
Yes.
Because without her, I couldn't have done any of these things.
My guest on Tell Me Your Story has been Philip G. Hubbard. Mr. Hubbard was the first black faculty member at the University of Iowa, the first black administrator at any of the 3 state universities, and as Vice President for Student Services, Phil Hubbard was the highest ranking minority group member in Iowa education circles. Professor Emeritus of Mechanical Engineering, he served as Dean of Academic Affairs and Vice President of Student Services. He was a recipient of the Hancher Finkbein Medallion Award, and last year the university named the land across from the Iowa Memorial Union Hubbard Park in his honor. The Philip G. Hubbard Human Rights Award was established in 1981 to honor a student who'd made a significant contribution to the cause of human rights at the university. Former U of I President Willard Boyd stated, "He's just an extraordinary human being," end quote. Philip Jones, Dean of Students at the U of I, is quoted as saying he has the ability to think the most of people. That's not something superficial. He's that way all the time. And finally, President Rawlings said Hubbard was a model and mentor for the entire university. Teacher, administrator, human rights advocate, role model, gentle persuader, husband, father, grandfather, a remarkable man with a remarkable story. Philip G. Hubbard has truly made a difference in this community, and we're grateful he chose Iowa City to be his home.